The following audio is a sample from Ascendant Chaos by Dave Todd, which is now available on Amazon in paperback and for Kindle. More information is available at the end of this recording. Chapter 1. Enter the Enforcer. Dwelling Street Mission. Abandoned Sector, Winston Enclave. Commercial Empire, Northam Continent. Thread. Activate Target Perspective 1.view. I felt pressure smothering my senses as I sat in the dim, crowded atmosphere of the mission leisure room. My mind felt like it was enveloped in an inescapable monotony as it screamed for relief. I could hear the chatter of veterans telling the same war stories I'd heard on numerous occasions. Noise emanated from the MCAST as some of the guys switched the feed to the latest sporting events. I heard discussion of the next day's plans for work in the distance, but that night I needed to hear something different. It had been 3 passes since I was placed at a local mission to be watched over without any memory or comprehension of my own identity. I possessed no recollection of my life before that day. I didn't know if I had family, where I had lived, or even what interests I had. All I could gather was that simply enduring the mundane slog of my life would not bring the answers to me. I would have to find them for myself. Several veterans lived in the Dwelling Street mission, most of whom had fought in the global war. On multiple occasions, I listened in on conversations describing the world state, comprising hundreds of political entities before the war. Numerous countries used to span each of the continents, maintained by governments supposedly committed to protecting their citizens, but in the present era, no such concept existed. Sure, population clusters could call themselves a country, but they were no more united than a cloud of dust settling on a hot summer wind. The devastation of war and infighting eventually fatigued the masses, but the embers of conflict only cooled for a time. After every survivor suffered loss in one fashion or another, treachery changed its face yet again, devouring the short-lived peace. New methods of destruction focused attacks on economies, education, and culture, morphing into the Smart Wars, which changed the planet into the geopolitical state of today. The leaders of the Global Alliance patterned their structure after the national conglomerate before its collapse, but with fewer heads of state in order to minimize dissent. The handful of talented politicians honored each other in lip service and appearance, but their only true craft was deciding on which knives to sharpen as they plotted behind their backs. The faction leaders and their sponsors became the remnant of society's elite, bent on assuming authority over the rest of us. Without demonstration of regard for anyone but those that they deemed beneficial, the faction leaders thus far have left us to carry on about our business. Conversely, the factions have proven their inability to function without the people, so discerning minds shouldn't be surprised that they have mastered the art of manipulating the ignorant, compelling them to fight for any contrived agenda. Irony continues to thrive, considering that faction leaders banned education for anyone unable to financially attain one. Naturally, the remnant of the educated consolidated within the shrunken cores of major enclaves, so that they could harbor the very knowledge which they claimed would initiate wars if captured by less responsible owners. As a result, vacant suburbs that spanned for treks barely contain handfuls of ruffians, recluses, or mission workers attempting to clean up and preserve the last dregs of a forgotten civilization. Due to the mass exodus of population centers during the global war, it was difficult to ignore the devastation of the conflict. Former metropolitan areas stood as ghost towns, their high-rise centers stood as ancient landmarks over an unnatural terrain. With a priority shift towards survival over substance, buildings and possessions lay dormant. Their previous owners never returned after they took up the lifestyle of self-governance in the rural regions. For those who dwelt between the tall urban shadows of the enclaves and the distant plains, they were forced to facilitate their own survival in the abandoned regions. To some, the truckloads of material goods just waiting to be found yielded an advantageous barter system, yet others pursued the opportunity to recover historic trinkets as high-value items ripe to be passed along to the remote dwellers. One such entity that filled the gap between the new and old was the Dwelling Street mission. The Dwelling Street mission operated out of a repurposed hotel, which was more upkept than its surroundings in the abandoned sector of the Winston Enclave. While the neighboring buildings bore the trademark of urban decay, the Dwelling Street mission provided a tiny glimmer of hope for the limited community that cared to interact with it. Div and Therese Merrick maintained the mission and its accommodations for its 30-some workers. Some of the workers, like myself, were derelicts willing to trade labor for lodging, while others simply enjoyed the prospect of benevolent work. Most residents enjoyed the work of the mission. It seldom involved the pressures of the enclaves, and it offered purpose by assisting inhabitants of the abandoned. Even though the mission's surroundings appeared dismal, its location was still within an arc or two drive of Core City in case of emergency, depending on the path chosen through the decrepit Dartway. With another day's hard work under my belt and little energy to endure the repetitive conversations in the leisure room, I could not shake the feeling that my life was one large enigma. After many exhaustive efforts, I was no closer to remembering who I was or where I came from. I sat numbly in the padded lounge chair, staring through the moving, flickering images on the Noptic display of the MCAST. Mission workers opposite me bickered about the latest statistics of the current Allcourt game, but I didn't share their enthusiasm. Neither their conversations nor the ranting of the sportscasters stimulated my brain. The related sound waves merely struck the designated tones on my eardrums and drifted back into the air from which they traveled. My mind continued poring over imaginary puzzles, trying to formulate them into questions without success, and the propaganda from the sportscasters failed to alleviate my unrest. There had to be something more to strive for than the suggestions of the incessant advertisements streaming through the MCAST, something more than the false hope of playing on a professional team that in reality reserved its roster for the elite and properly cultured. There had to be something more than the latest celebrity endorsements attempting to convince me that I needed the latest organic implants to improve my muscle structure, stamina, or mental acuity. There had to be something more than routinely recycling the ownerless belongings of a decaying metropolis. Every path I could imagine floated in the air and hooked itself on the surrounding walls, until the walls themselves grew so thick that I sensed that they would come to life and crush me like a compactor. It was time to move, so I hoisted myself out of the cozy chair which supported my frame and headed for the entrance to the mission. If anyone asked me where I was going, I didn't hear them. I needed to clear my head. At times, walking along the silent streets of the abandoned had a calming effect. Before I headed for the open air, I stopped in my room and donned my black fleece pullover, the one with a white stripe along the sleeves. I expected the air to be getting chilly, so I decided it best not to freeze to death from venturing out unprepared. I brushed back my dusty blonde hair, tucking it underneath my black treadball cap, which I twisted until the brim jutted from the back of my head. I made my way toward the door when something compelled me to look in the mirror. I didn't think some hidden inner reflection would jump out at me with answers, but I stepped over to the reflective glass regardless. My complacent eyes hid behind average glasses, and the blank expression on my rounded face affirmed my need to find meaning in my existence. My bulky frame was not one given to athletics, so I didn't know why I was venturing out into the abandon to risk the dangers of the night. I turned away from the mirror, no more hopeful of finding an answer there than in the Dwelling Street mission itself. After clearing the mission entryway and stepping into the evening air, a light breeze struck my face. The sun was setting in the distance, changing the sky color to brilliant hues of orange and red. The frequent walks still proved valuable for exercise and mental therapy, even though I got plenty of the former from the rigorous workload that Div assigned regularly by way of container shuffling from building to cart, cart to building. On occasion, I picked a new road to travel at random. I rarely cared where I was headed, so I just started walking. To keep my mind active, I would sometimes contemplate what the local structures were like at the zenith of their occupancy. I was surrounded by professional buildings where executives conducted their business, supermarkets that housed aisles of supplies for daily consumers, fuel stations awaiting empty tanks of many a motor box, restaurants servicing thousands a day, and factories manufacturing any mechanical or technological contraption that the human mind could conceive. They had long since been converted to empty husks, leaving little room for imagination once salvagers picked them clean. As the sun dipped from its perch on the horizon, I felt the wind temperature drop, causing me to rethink my impulsive behavior. I halted my stroll to turn up the collar of my pullover and keep the wind's chill off my neck. Before resuming my stroll, something caught my eye. I couldn't decipher if it was a reflection of the fading sunlight on a metallic object or just my imagination, but it struck my curiosity nevertheless. A narrow, dark alley spanned the gap between a couple of multi-level apartment complexes. I began walking toward the entrance to the alley when a searing headache made me freeze in my tracks, nearly causing me to collapse to the ground. Before I could even identify the cause of the headache, it had already dissipated. Even more peculiar, the headache was accompanied by a whisper as if it traveled on the wind. "Straight and narrow is the gate," hissed the sound in my skull. I whirled around to see if there was someone nearby. I felt like I was in a bad horror Mika, awaiting some grotesque villain to jump out and spread my internal organs along the ground. My heart raced at the conjured vision of an unseen assailant leaping from the shadows. My paranoia ran high, yet my curiosity kept it in check as I took a step toward the alley entrance. I squinted to make sure that I didn't trip over scattered trash and random rubble. The apartments cast deep shadows over the alley, blocking any possible dusk light, yet I still saw an indiscernible light at the end of the dark tunnel which still held my attention. Meandering forward, I stumbled through the alley, checking to make sure that my form was still intact. As I looked up, I found the odd light source that had cast bizarre reflections through the alley. A 5-deck administrative building of the most irregular fashion glinted in the fading light, shooting beams in the most unlikely of directions. It was surreal to witness the shape of the building among so many others with linear, squared construction. It was as if the builder's architect had the blueprints absconded by his child, who then scribbled an abundance of crossing lines over the design, which ultimately made their way into final construction. To offset the unusual facade, waterfall-shaped curves capped either of the building's front corners. Stepping closer, I looked for any signage that might indicate the former purpose of the building. Any time a salvage op rolled through, they would remove old signage to inform future salvagers that the building had already been picked over. Commonly, government and financial institutions were choice finds, leaving few remnants for any operators late to the scene. Looking around, I saw that remaining establishments still had signs visible. I spotted a clothing outlet, supermarket, and a handful of corporate offices, suggesting that the building in question had greater value than those untouched. I walked up the cold paved steps of the abandoned building. The evening breeze sent a chill down my spine. At least I suspected it was from the breeze. I poked around some remains scattered along the entryway to the building. Finding nothing of interest, I gave up the hunt for the building's name and decided to investigate the traditional way. I approached the sleek but grungy glass doors of the building. Without a power grid to run the structure, the old motion sensor failed to respond. I wedged my fingers into the crease between the doors. Initially resisting my efforts due to passes of unuse, the doors eventually gave way to my prying. The gap widened just enough for me to squeeze through, but just as I was about to enter the building, the paranoia of being watched crept back into my mind. I whirled around and looked behind me to see if I could find the unseen eyes that were haunting me. It was common for stragglers to live in the abandoned, but I had yet to observe any sight or sound to suggest that I was not alone. I held my breath so that my ears could detect any abnormal sound patterns. All I heard was silence beyond a slight howl of the wind. As I slipped through the door, my mind switched back to curiosity mode to squelch the lingering paranoia. Since my life was typically saturated with never-ending simplicity, it felt refreshing to explore and deviate from the normalcy of the daily grind. After squeezing most of my body through the doorway, a spring mechanism engaged in the frame, causing the door to slide closed. Panicking, I tried to finish my entry, but my foot got caught and I stumbled to the floor. Trying to roll over cautiously without spraining my ankle, I kicked at the door with my free foot. Having no success, I sat forward and with difficulty from my seated position, shook my pinched leg free of its captor by pushing the doors outward with my fingertips. Questioning my judgment about whether or not entering an abandoned building alone was such a wise idea, I ambled my way into its interior. The building was pitch black, which came as no surprise. I placed one hand along the wall and felt my way around until I encountered a board at least one mark from the floor. Taking a gamble, I knocked on the board. The vibration knocked dust loose from the crevice between the board and its frame. After hearing the hollow echo and seeing a faint trace of moonlight creep through the crevice, I came to the realization that the windows had been boarded. I pounded on the board to shake enough dust loose to make room for my already raw fingers. With a grunt, I shoved my fingers behind the board and gave it a heave. The nails holding the board in place gave way, and the piece of wood crashed to the floor with a loud echo that panned out along the building interior. Moonlight flooded into the room with enough silver light so that my eyes could once again adjust to my surroundings. I saw shelving structures lining the floor as far as the darkness allowed. Intrigued, I walked along some of the narrow aisles. The building had a soft carpet, and sound didn't travel as well in contrast to other buildings I had occupied, which were designed for industrial means. My thoughts drifted back to a conversation with Chuck, my work buddy, about some of the Empyrean regulations. Before the mission was allowed to support renovation and restructuring of the abandoned enclave, Div was required to sign an agreement that operators would report any findings related to education. Snapping back to the present, I realized what the building was. It was a library, or at least it had been. Deciding not to venture too far from my limited light source, I scoured the aisles with interest. There were no books or paraphernalia to be found, but still the thought of seeing the inside of a library was amazing. I had heard a story or two about them over casual conversation while we unloaded goods from many a place during working arcs. As my initial curiosity overruled caution, lack of expectation and discovery prompted my boredom to take over. Rounding the next aisle, I opted to head back toward the door. Keeping my hand close to something stable at all times and ensuring that I didn't stumble in the low lighting, I gingerly notched my way back to the silver light seeping through the window. Upon re-entering visible light, my shin slammed into the leg of an overturned desk. "Ow!" I yelled, bending down to rub my shin. The echo of my voice bounced off the walls multiple times before fading into oblivion. Curious of my attacker, I walked my hands around the surface of the desk. I managed to find the front of the desk and realized that most of the drawers had been removed. This was fairly standard procedure when purging a building. To my surprise, though, I discovered that a drawer was still intact. I found a handle to the drawer and gave it a tug, but it hardly budged. Determined, I placed one foot against the desk for support and yanked on the handle of the drawer. Breaking the drawer free of its cove, I stumbled, slamming my back into a shelf, but as the drawer dangled in my hand, I heard a faint thump as something else broke free of the desk's frame. Supposing that I had knocked the railing loose, I swept my free hand across the floor to find the mystery object. My right hand found pay dirt, but it was not a piece of the desk. Dropping the mangled drawer on the floor, I knelt down to scoop up the object. My heart raced when I began to suspect the nature of the cold, rectangular object in my hand. Limping into the moonlight, I walked up to the window to illuminate my prize. Sure enough, it was a book. I brushed dust off the dark cover, nearly triggering a sneezing fit. I turned the book over multiple times, staring at the sealed pages. They appeared to give off a faint, light blue glow. At first, I thought the silvery pages were reflecting the moonlight, but when I moved the book back into the darkness, the glow remained. I found symbols on the cover that I didn't recognize. As I ran my fingers across the leathery cover, a name formed in the same light blue color, reading Criterion. I attempted to flip through the book, but most of the pages appeared stuck together. I tried to peel them apart, but something more than glue or chewing gum held them fast, a mystery which required further investigation. Deciding that it was time to retire from my adventure, I tucked my findings away until I had more light to work with. I started toward the exit, but froze in my tracks upon hearing grinding metal as someone struggled to open the entry doors. I dashed behind a shelving unit to avoid detection. The newcomers managed to get the door open, which then drew my attention to the footsteps that I heard in the entryway. "This has got to be the biggest sack of fish bait I've ever seen, sophomore," said an irritated voice, accompanying one set of footsteps. "I mean, is Jock paranoid or something? He's never sent us back to review our performance. We clean up a building, and bam, we start the next." I peeked around the corner to view the new arrivals as the other one replied, "You need to chill, Jammer. Jock has his reasons. The commercial empire may be cracking down on policy, so who knows? You do know why libraries and bookstores are so significant, don't you?" I couldn't hear the reply from the other individual, but the one who posed the question continued. "Books are one of the most durable sources of information, even more than data tanks. If they get into the hands of just anybody, then people start getting ideas. And if people start getting ideas, then they are more difficult to control." All I could hear from the other one, who had been referred to as Jammer, was a, "Why do you have to go philosophize everything?" he said, stumbling on his intended words. "How's that go?" the sophomore asked sarcastically. "Shut up," Jammer replied, annoyed at being harassed about his impromptu vocabulary. His complaints were immediately followed by a click, and I saw a bright path of light sweep across the room. The new arrivals had come more prepared, considering they had solar torches in their possession. Sensing the need for an exit strategy, I wandered through the dark maze, hoping to sneak behind the searching individuals. I was willing to bet that they left the door propped open. "Hey, what is this?" I heard sophomore say, from the direction of the window that I liberated. Fearing discovery, I quickened my pace toward the door, but it only caused me to stumble. "What was that?" shouted one of the voices, snapping to attention. They panned their solar torches in my direction, and I bolted for the door as I stuffed the book under my belt to free both of my hands. "Get him!" Jammer yelled. As suspected, my pursuers had propped the door open with a crate. I had to hop the crate, but with minimal effort I cleared the obstruction. I dashed down the steps of the library and ran toward the alley. Without turning about, I could tell that my pursuers weren't far behind. Just paces from the entrance to the alley, I felt adrenaline pumping into my system as I instructed my muscles to move faster. The footsteps of my pursuers increased in volume. "Let's show 'em what we do to poachers on academy turf," one voice yelled. I thought that I felt someone's breath on my neck as a hand reached forward to grab my shoulder. A defensive mechanism fired in my brain as something clamped onto my arm, prompting me to twist free and continue running. I hoped that the darkness would become my ally if I could just reach the alley. Before impeding my escape, the grip released as my foe yelped either in pain or surprise. "What the?" shouted the other voice from the street. I was halfway down the alley when I realized that I was no longer being chased. As my curiosity resurfaced, I wanted to know what hindered my quarry from beating me to a pulp. Sticking to the shadows, I crept back to the edge of the alley to observe the commotion. A third unannounced individual had appeared. He must have kicked one of my pursuers, since one of them was massaging an injury to his side. "Who are you?" Jammer snapped. The expression on Jammer's dark face was not one of welcome. I noticed that he and Sophomore were both wearing lightweight jackets and denim pants. Sophomore had a loose flannel shirt underneath, but Jammer also sported an all-court jersey, nylon cap, and had a chain running from a side pocket to another in the back. I had seen such chains before in personal effects that we removed from residential salvage. They were usually used to secure a berry clip to one's person, so I didn't understand why Jammer was quickly reaching to remove the excess linkage from his pocket. The third individual, who was draped in a black cloak, just stood his ground without reply. Jammer and Sophomore started to circle around him. Before long, Jammer completely withdrew the chain from his pockets and held the center of the lengthy chain in his hand. The ends of the chain merged into weights, which prompted me to designate the object as a striking weapon. Jammer faked a swing with his chain whip, but the mystery person was not impressed. The defender reacted by whipping his cloak away in a circular fashion, tossing it to the ground. The pale moonlight revealed a man wearing black loose pants and a blue vest covering a gray sleeveless shirt. His head was covered with a blue camouflage bandana which tied into a knot in the back. The most peculiar thing was that he was wearing sunglasses, despite daylight's departure. My two assailants noticed the oddity and were quick to comment. "Isn't it a little dark for shades?" Sophomore snorted. The mystery man paused and looked at both individuals before replying in a low, reflective tone. "Do not be so quick to mistake one's visual imitation for another's blindness to truth." Taken aback by his response, Jammer and Sophomore looked at each other and laughed. "What kind of nonsense is that?" Jammer said mockingly. "I think he just called us a couple of fish," Sophomore said. Uninterested in conversation, Sophomore charged the newcomer, who easily read the advance. A push to Sophomore's back caused him to lose balance, nearly putting him on the ground. Jammer swung his chain over his head and snapped it toward the defender's face. After a couple of near misses, the defender kicked his foot into the air, catching the chain whip, forcing the end to wrap around his shoe. The defender then slammed his foot to the ground, causing the chain to pull Jammer's torso with it. With Jammer's face at a vulnerable height, the defender switched his feet and slammed a kick into Jammer's jaw, causing him to reel backward. Jammer staggered across the pavement as he fell. Further enraged at the sight of his ally being pummeled, Sophomore decided to unlatch the large buckle on the belt hidden by his flannel shirt tails. His belt, like Jammer's chain, was designed to be a weapon too. Whirling the leather belt and weighted buckle overhead, Sophomore whipped the buckle at the defender's face. Still unimpressed, the mystery figure revealed a forked weapon with a long center blade. With a sharp spin, he threw the weapon at Sophomore. The handle of the weapon struck Sophomore in the forehead before clattering to the ground. Sophomore stumbled and clutched his head, reeling from the jarring impact to his skull. Jammer dusted himself off and snapped into a high aerial spin kick. Sensing the attack, the defender spun low, passing his foot underneath the kicker's airborne body, causing the kick to miss completely. The defender evaded more half-hearted kicks before jumping, spinning a full circle, and slamming the bottom of his foot to Jammer's face. Fighting against the dizziness, Sophomore regained his balance and dashed forward, only to pause as he followed the defender's stare to the ground where his chrome weapon lay. Sophomore advanced to step on the weapon and pick it up before the defender could recover it. Amused, the defender extended his hand, which was lined with fingerless gloves. The metal weapon leapt from the ground and snapped to the defender's hand just as Sophomore's foot landed where the weapon had been. The defender swiftly spun the weapon around and relocated it to his side. Jammer mustered his remaining strength to take down the mystery figure. He stepped forward and hurled himself into the air. As his body flipped forward, Jammer locked his leg out, attempting to drop his heel over the defender's head, but the figure sidestepped the flip and drove his foot into Jammer's gut. Jammer's body continued the flipping motion, but the kick knocked both wind and consciousness out of the agile attacker. Seizing the opportunity, Sophomore grabbed the defender's arms, hoping to immobilize him. The defender slammed his head backward, catching Sophomore in the nose. Staggering, Sophomore released his grip on the defender's arms, but it was the last thing that he was going to remember about the evening. With his arms free, the defender spun and connected a back elbow with Sophomore's temple. With a groan, Sophomore fell to the street. I cringed upon seeing the impact. I turned to run back down the alley, but before I could, the defender whirled around and stared in my direction. I knew that he was looking directly at me. How he knew I was there, I didn't know, but I felt an uncanny awareness coming from the person who was responsible for beating the stuffing out of my attackers. He took a step forward and paused. Knowing that my shadowy cover was nullified, I debated whether I should step into the moonlight and thank him, or stay where I was for fear of receiving the same reception issued to Jammer and Sophomore. I stared at the defender's shades, sensing that the eyes behind them were probing the darkness. As I stepped out of my hiding spot, he tracked my movement. Continuing my observation of his shades, I noticed that part of his eyes became visible even in the pale glow of the moonlight, but what I saw following sent shivers down my spine. The center of his eyes lit up with color and fluctuation, showing even through the dark lenses before dissipating back into the night. As I continued to stare, a sudden realization nearly caused my skeleton to leap from my skin. The figure standing in the street looked just like me. "Did you find what you were looking for?" the figure asked in a monotone voice. I mumbled, my voice trailing off in a mixture of panic and confusion. I didn't know whether this man was friend or foe, but my first impulse was to withhold my findings from the stripped library. "Who are you?" I stammered. Uninterested in my question, he turned to pick up his cloak. As he donned the cloak, he began walking away. "Who are you?" I asked again with more confidence. The only response given was a wave of the hand. My rescuer did not look back. Thinking that my eyes were playing tricks on me, I blinked as the mysterious figure continued walking. His body slowly disappeared into the night. I knew that my eyesight was strained, but I wasn't blind. He just disappeared like a phantom. Confused, I continued staring at his last observable location until I heard a groan come from one of the downed attackers. Quickly acknowledging my need to leave, I turned back down the alley and ran toward the mission. Congrats on taking your first steps along an epic journey. Audio releases have been made possible through the generosity of Patreon members. If you would like to keep up to date on audio releases, visual concepts, or project updates, be sure to check out patreon.com/theenforceros. If you would like to read the full story in paperback or on Kindle, check out Ascendant Chaos on Amazon.com. Eyes on, it's going to be a wild ride.